Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming this afternoon. Briefly, my name is Brett Burkhart. I'm a sociology professor in the School of Public Policy here at OSU. I'm happy to do the honors of introducing our guest, Dr. Seamus Khan. I first met Seamus in graduate school at the University of Wisconsin. He was known to be a stellar student at the time, very generous with his time as well. Since those early days, that trajectory has continued. He's gone on to do some great things in academia and beyond. He's now chair and professor of sociology at Columbia University. He has published over 90 articles, essays, and books. Those books include Privilege, The Making of an Adolescent Elite at St. Paul's School, Practice of Research, and Approaches to Ethnography. But Seamus also writes for broader audiences, so he's contributed pieces to outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post, New Yorker, Time Magazine. Among other honors, Seamus was awarded Columbia University's Presidential Teaching Award in 2016, and I didn't know this, but in 2018 he was awarded the Hans Zettelberg Prize from Uppsala University in Sweden for the best sociologist under 40.
They're no longer under 40.
So he's here today to talk about his new book. That's a book co-authored with Jennifer Hirsch, by the way, entitled Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus. I'll note that we have grassroots books here. You may have seen they have a station set up outside, just outside the door here, with books for sale. And after the talk, Seamus will be around signing books for those who might be interested. So, with that said, please join me in welcoming Seamus Khan.
Thank you so much. I think my mic is on. Yeah, it is on. I can hear it. There are more chairs. There's 2 more chairs up here, and I can I kind of pulled 2 out. So if anybody standing wants a chair in the back, I'm happy to provide it. Today I'm going to be talking on this book I worked on with Jennifer, and actually as part of a broader research project that involved over 30 researchers. And so not all the work is my work alone. In fact, none of the work is my work alone. And many of the arguments are not mine alone, although you should hold me solely accountable for anything I say. I'm also going to tell a series of stories. This book is narratively driven on the basis of ethnographic account of the lives of college students at Columbia and Barnard University over a 2-year period. And so, as just a content warning, many of the stories will be stories of assault. After years at an elite but very sheltered boarding school, Lucy was eager to begin to leave behind her nerdy high school life. She wanted to lose her virginity, to party, and to be popular. The first Saturday after classes began, she went out with Nancy, another first-year student. And they met 2 seniors at one of the bars near campus. Nancy danced with one, and the other, Scott, bought Lucy a drink. They flirted for a while, and he asked Lucy if she wanted to go back to the frat house with him. She said yes. They stumbled up Amsterdam Avenue, towards Fraternity Row in the warm summer night. Scott had forgotten his keys, so they made out on the stoop for a while, waiting for someone to let them in. Lucy's phone rang and rang, and while she finally answered, it was Nancy, headed back towards campus to catch up with her. Scott reluctantly agreed to wait, and the 3 eventually climbed the steps, passing through a carved entryway covered with decades of peeling paint. Scott steered Lucy upstairs, and Nancy followed. Lucy paused to chat excitedly with someone, but Scott was impatient, and so they continued their ascent. Scott made drinks for both of the girls. Nancy passed out the moment she sat down on the couch. And so Scott asked Lucy if she wanted to come see his room. She said yes, and so they went up 1 more floor. She was excited. This was what college was really all about. He closed the door and they started making out again, but he pushed her down onto the bed and started taking off her pants. She said, "No, don't," to which he responded, "It's okay." But it wasn't okay. He ended up raping Lucy, and Lucy recounted saying no again. But eventually she gave up and waited for him to finish. This is kind of a classic account of assault that happens on college campus. And we can't make sense of what happened to Lucy without thinking about gender inequality, which is the socially organized unequal relations between women and men. But there's a great deal that we miss if we just focus on gender, or we do this analysis through a strictly gendered lens. Scott's behavior was amplified by his control over space, by Lucy's newness on campus, and by his access to additional alcohol. It was also amplified by his capacity to drink more than she could. In this dense set of resources, they tend to come together for older students, usually men, but in some instances women. My point here, and the point of this talk, is not going to let Scott say, society made me rape her. But instead, I want us to understand the social forces that produce situations in which assaults are likely to occur. And that doesn't mean that people shouldn't be held accountable. After all, we heard a lot of stories that started exactly like this one, but ended up differently. Before I go any further, I want to give you a sense of the broader project that this narrative that I'm going to present today draws from. In the summer of 2014, Columbia was gearing up to be part of the American Association of Universities' multi-campus survey about sexual assault and gender-based misconduct. But something was missing from this conversation. And that thing that was missing was a focus on prevention. What the project that I'm a part of, and really something that Jennifer advanced and I joined her in, was trying to think more about the social context that produces assaults and how that we might prevent them. So to put this in stark relief, we spend a lot of time on adjudication, on what to do after something happens, and a lot less time on prevention, that is, trying to prevent something in the first place. And the book that we've written is really an attempt to move the needle on prevention in a wide variety of ways that goes beyond consent education and bystander intervention. So Jennifer Hirsch, a public health researcher, and Claude-Anne Malins, a clinical psychologist, helped lead the Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, or SHIFT is what I'll call it. And it was a giant, almost moon-scale project. We had 8 faculty members working on it, 30 other researchers, and there were 3 major pieces. A quantitative study, which I'm not going to speak much about today, but I certainly can, which included survey research, so a random population survey research with a response rate of around 67%, which is, for a survey of this kind, quite high. A daily diary, which was a group of people who took a research instrument every day for 60 days, so 500 people, which gave us a moving window of their experiences of sex, sexual assault, sleep, substance use, mental health, socialization over a 24-hour period. And then an ethnography, which I co-led with Jennifer, and which included doing focus groups, so almost 20 focus groups, interviewing 151 students, and those interviews were about 2 hours long each, where we talked to them about their lives and their sexual experiences. For 25 of those students, we did multiple rounds of follow-up interviews because there was so much to talk about. But we also had younger researchers, people who look considerably younger than I do, integrated into campus life. So they were in fraternity basements and hanging out at sororities. They were in common rooms, religious spaces, athletic buses, and Jennifer and I hung out in public spaces like dining halls, sports events, things like that. And so taken together, this project was meant to sort of try to reconceptualize or at least draw upon a much more ecological understanding of what's happening on campuses today. The resultant work has been sort of dozens of papers, or over a dozen papers, probably by the end it'll be dozens of papers, so many are in process. But Jennifer and I really wanted to write a book targeted towards a broad audience of partially scholars, but also students, parents, and policymakers. And that book, Sexual Citizens, is really grounded in 3 basic concepts. And these are going to be the 3 concepts that I sort of use and interweave through the narrative accounts that I'll provide you today. And those are sexual projects, sexual citizenship, and sexual geographies. Sexual projects denote the goals, and the wide range of goals, from gaining status to acquiring experience to sharing intimacy or experiencing pleasure, that answer the question, what is sex for? So part of the approach of our project is to say that people have sex for lots of reasons. Sometimes we have sex for pleasure, sometimes we have sex to increase our status, sometimes we have sex to give a partner comfort. Sometimes we have sex to have some new kind of experience. And that the different reasons why people are having sex are absolutely essential to understand if we're going to understand not just sex, but also sexual assault. And the reason for that is that most assaults are consensual until they're not. And so we need to understand the context of sexual situations and the differences between those situations that end up being assaultative and those that do not. Sexual citizenship refers to people's understanding of their right to choose to have or not to have sexual experiences. And importantly, the recognition that the people that you're having sexual experiences with have an equivalent right. And so one of the arguments that we make consistently throughout the book is that we as communities have failed to both give people a sense of what sex is for, so to help people answer the question what it is they want out of their sexual lives, but also we failed at developing and cultivating a sense of sexual citizenship. That is, that people have the right to say yes to sex, that they have the right to say no to sex, and that the people that they are having sex with have equivalent rights. And we find that the failures of sexual citizenship are gendered in important ways, which I'll talk about. Sexual geography is the third concept, situates the choices that people make in social space, calling attention to space as both a producer of vulnerability to assault and as a key modifiable dimension for prevention. You may think it's strange to talk about space in this way, but this is a sort of classically sociological tradition where we think about the ways in which the built environment affects behavior. So look at this room right now for a moment. Like, who can speak in right now? Me, because you're all facing me. And so the very structure of the space produces a kind of interaction. And there are similar ways in which college spaces are often structured in such a way that they determine, not completely determine, but they create pathways to particular futures. Think, for example, of a dorm room. Within a dorm room, there typically are 4 pieces of furniture: a desk, a chair, a bureau, and a bed. If 2 people go at the end of an evening to a dorm room together, where are they going to sit? They're going to sit together on a bed. And like it or not, beds have social meanings. And so we might think about the physical space, or the geographies of campus, as things that produce particular sexual opportunity structures, but also are modifiable dimensions that could influence the ways in which we think about prevention. And importantly, I'm going to tie sexual geographies to patterns of inequality on campuses today. We heard a lot of stories that started out exactly like Scott and Lucy's, but ended differently. Daria met Rob at a party hosted by seniors on the East Campus suite. They'd each had several cups of whatever weird punch was on offer, and looking back, Daria described herself as pretty drunk. Rob walked her to her dorm room and went upstairs with her. Once they were in his room, he put his arms around her, kissing her and unbuttoning her shirt. She kissed him back, but wasn't really into it, and so she told him she just wanted to go to sleep and that he should leave. He asked for her number, concerned because she was so drunk. He texted her the next morning to see how she was feeling, and they met for coffee. As the months wore on, they became friends. A social analysis of sexual assault requires asking what, other than individual morality or students' relative grasp of the rules of consent, shapes the outcomes of these moments. Consider, for example, the differences between Daria in her own room asking Rob to leave and Lucy in Scott's room on the 3rd floor of the fraternity. Research on campus sexual assault has largely looked at gendered power by examining heterosexual couples and men's single-sex organizations. Even the name of the problem within policy circles, gender-based violence, emphasizes a singular aspect of inequality. Certainly, the preponderance of campus sexual assaults are committed by men and experienced by women. Men do exert power over women, both interpersonally and institutionally. But even in assaults that fit the narrative, individuals are situated among multiple hierarchies. Yes, gender, but also race, socioeconomic status, sexual identity, sexual experience, adjustment to college, access to material resources, peer networks. Still, other forms of power, age, control over space, relative sobriety, might be more situational. And if assault's always about power, then we also need to think about the way in which power can shed light both on elevated vulnerability by other populations. And here I might point to LGBTQ students and the less numerous instances in which heterosexual men are assaulted by women. If you're looking for a topic sentence for my talk, you're not going to get one. Well, you get 2. The first is that different types of assault are produced by different types of power dynamics. Assault is not one thing, it's many different kinds of things. And this is why addressing it's going to be particularly difficult or challenging, because we're going to need a multi-layered, multi-sectoral approach. Second, our accounting of power relations in campus sexual assault must be more intersectional and must acknowledge the social fluidity of power. That there are forms of power which are situational, and that the same person could be on either side of the power relationship. And I'm going to tell a series of stories that hopefully highlight this. Today, those stories are going to be clustered around two sets. The first, several in which men assault women, illustrating the complexity of power dynamics at play. And the second, stories about assaults that are experienced by queer students, by students of color, and by men. Throughout, I'll point to the intertwining of forms of power that are contextual, specifically peer support, drunkenness, and you're in school, and those that are relatively relational, such as race, queerness, and gender. Cindy curled her long legs up into the chair during the interview as the words poured out. The spring of her freshman year, she'd been rejected from her top choice sorority and was worried that her ideal college experience, her vision of what college was going to be for, was slipping from her grasp. Being invited to a party hosted by juniors and seniors was a step towards one of her goals, being a never-say-no kind of person. She met a junior that night at the party. She didn't stay long, but he got her number. Over the course of the evening, as she and her friends party hopped, his texts kept coming. She wasn't really sure if she was interested, but when she asked her friend if she should go hang out with them, her friend said, "Why not?" And that drowned out her reservations. Her phone died, and that seemed to make the decision for her, since she stopped getting his texts. But when she got back to her dorm, there he was, waiting in the lobby. She felt that he'd come all this way, and so agreed to go back to his dorm room with him, although she didn't really want to fool around. Once there, her discomfort grew. She tried to derail the situation by asking for a tour of his dorm. He dutifully, if impatiently, walked her around the kitchen and the living areas, ending their short stroll back in his room. He began to undress her. She pointed out that she didn't want to have sex, and she said she clearly told him so. She eventually pleaded with him that she was a virgin and a freshman. He asked, "Do you have a boyfriend?" She continued to tell him to stop. He held her down and raped her. He was much bigger than she was, but the power relevant to making sense of this interaction extended far beyond the physical or even the individual. There they were in his single room, that recurring privilege of junior and senior housing. The power of the group also features here. Having just been rejected by a sorority that she wanted, she was much more primed to go along when her friend told her that yes, she should go hang out with him that night and she should quote-unquote enjoy her life. And in the background were complex demands of doing gender correctly as a young woman, which to her meant demonstrating that she was up for anything, sexually adventurous, she was her idealized self, and she wanted to be agreeable. She felt an obligation to him because he had walked an entire 5 minutes across campus to wait in her lobby. Without question, some assaults, like Lucy's, happen in the context of men's single-sex organizations where control over space and control over alcohol are amplified by institutional prestige. And we might think about the ways in which institutional rules that give men in single-sex organizations like fraternity control over the access to and distribution of alcohol in party spaces influence gendered patterns of assault. But the similarities between Lucy's and Cindy's are instructive. The age difference between them and the men who assaulted them are not that great, but small differences index consequential inequalities in resources. In colleges and high school, age becomes a stand-in for social power, access to desirable space, knowledge of rules, self-confidence, legal access to alcohol, and stronger peer networks. If the goal of the ethnography is to make the familiar strange, then one point here is to press you to think critically about gendered age differences in sexual partnerships. The pairing of first-year women with upper-class men represents a situation in which class year arguably brings many more power advantages than gender. What I mean by that is just think for a moment about the different ways in which people partner along gendered lines relative to age. It's fairly uncommon for freshman men to partner with senior women, and it's much more common for senior men to partner with freshmen or junior women. And that has really strong consequences. Another way of thinking about that is that as women age through, say, a community, their available sexual partners decrease. That is, they're less likely to have like dating pools of men who are significantly younger, whereas as men age through communities, their sexual pools often increase in number, and this is enormously consequential. Liliana's story of relationship violence points to other power disparities. When she first mentioned the relationship, she ascribed their frequent and very acrid conflict to the fact that they came from, quote, very different backgrounds. Liliana recounted ongoing verbal abuse from her boyfriend, who belonged to a, quote, niche at Columbia that I didn't fit in with at all, and that I knew I didn't. They were pretty anti-feminist, they called me a feminazi, they called me a bitch. These were my boyfriend's best friends. Liliana looked back with a deep sense of shame. I'm so embarrassed about that period. It just doesn't reflect any of my values that I hold. I stood up for myself, but not to the extent that I should have, necessarily. She explains it in part as being a first-year student without a lot of perspective. I think it was just me as a woman engineer, not knowing many guys at school, and just feeling like I guess this is what Columbia men are like. I guess this is what dating is like. When we asked her why she stayed in a relationship for 8 months, she paused. So long, in fact, that we checked in to make sure that she was okay. She noted how much more sexually experienced he was than her. I would say quadruple the experience he had, she said. And then her language became very precise. He performed oral sex on me and had a cold sore, HSV-1, and transmitted HSV-1 to me genitally, which is obviously every girl's nightmare, especially a girl who doesn't have any sexual experience. That was beyond traumatizing because I had no sexual experience, and I think I felt like my sexual opportunities were over. I was so overdramatic. I was devastated. It destroyed me. I considered taking medical leave from school. I was all right, I'm never getting married. I'm never having kids. It was pretty early on, and I knew that the relationship was total shit at this point, total shit, and I was like, oh my God, I've ruined my entire life. I felt like my life was older. I told my mom, obviously I told a gynecologist. I didn't have anything else to do. I went on medication so that I'd never transmit it to anyone else, but I was like, oh my God, how did this happen to me? Because I only had protected sex before, and I never thought my entire life, even though I had progressive sex education, I was never taught to use a dental dam when giving oral sex, and I hated myself. I felt like, okay, you blew it, you blew college, and I felt like I couldn't have kids. We rarely interrupted a student or corrected them when they provided us with wrong information in an interview, but with Liliana we couldn't help ourselves, and we gently noted, none of these things are true. She shook her head again. Yeah, I know that none of them are true, but she continued, recounting her belief that having a viral STI scuttled not just her college sexual project, but her entire life project. In a socially loaded way, I'd always sort of been like, it's good that I've waited. It's good that I haven't had casual sex. A way that's totally socially determined and based on these standards of feminine virginity and purity and innocence and whatever. And I avoided those things because I felt like they were socially not desirable. And I just ended up being totally screwed over having this marker of promiscuity, having this marker of being a whore. I don't know how to reconcile it with my identity of not having much sexual experience compared to my peers. Liliana understood her boyfriend's behavior as a reflection of his working class upbringing, although certainly there were other students whose cross-class relationships did not devolve into searing verbal abuse. We read this story and his behavior in relationship to the masculine prestige hierarchies on campus. Liliana's boyfriend was at the very bottom. A white working class kid, as she called him, he and his friends were part of a team that was not respected. Crew was at the top of the heap, followed by closely other rich people sports, like tennis, squash, and sailing. His team, by contrast, was subjected to widespread social disparagement. He'd grown up in a context where saying, that's retarded, or that's so gay, were pretty everyday. At Columbia, this marked him as being a bigot and a homophobe. In our analysis, he and the other men were responding to a feeling of being symbolically dominated by higher status men, and they challenged the things they felt put them at the bottom of the status hierarchy. This included feminism, but also what they read as political correctness. This doesn't justify abusive behavior, but it does help understand it. Gendered power relations on campus encompass relationships between men and women, as well as among men and women. Groups of men at the bottom of the hierarchy are perceived as socially undesirable. And we need to remember that unwanted sexualized contact often has social desirability built into the idea of wanting. Where was I? Oh, there. At Columbia, more powerful men described themselves as feminists and as welcoming gay people. They wielded their social power against men at the bottom of the hierarchy, creating distance and difference by describing them as misogynistic, homophobic, and in a word that we heard again and again and again, as being rapey. Such social domination helps produce gendered sexual violence in two ways. First, sexual contact with men who are seen as less desirable is more likely to be perceived or experienced as unwanted. Second, lower status men challenge their domination in part by challenging the very principles of hierarchy that dominates them. That is, these lower status men resist domination, collectively rejecting campus culture by embracing misogynistic, homophobic, or racist violence and language. We didn't just hear about this from her. It wasn't Liliana who told us the story. We heard about it from others, and we saw it all the time in our fieldwork. They called women bitches, they used the word fag, they railed against feminism, and expressed political attitudes many of their peers viewed as contemptible. Their low social position is both the result of these attitudes and actions and a response to the experience of domination, a response to the dominant mores and norms that seek to keep them at the bottom of the campus social hierarchy. Understanding power, then, means thinking about how particular groups or institutions place people in positions that are more dominant or more dominated within a prestige structure, and how such positions enable certain kinds of behaviors and attitudes. What Liliana experienced was sometimes referred to as relationship violence. But that focuses attention only on the relationship between the person being abusive and the person who's the target of that bad behavior or that abuse. Our interpretation of Liliana's story points to the many other relationships that produced that violence, including those between her ex-boyfriend and his teammates, and between the team and the rest of campus. There are temporal dimensions to this as well. Settling into school is thrilling, successful, and sadly quite dangerous. For students, it's a high-stakes moment, an extended process through which they decide which extracurriculars to pursue and then frequently compete for entry into them. They can reinvent themselves from high school, and they can set themselves upon a college project they've planned, which for many includes a particular kind of sexual project. That is, learning to be sexually skilled was something that people were very interested in. Scholars call these first few months of freshman year the red zone, that period of increased vulnerability to sexual assault and all kinds of other things, but particularly sexual assault. The red zone may be a period of the greatest risk, but it is socially produced and certainly not inevitable. Marla, who we'd interviewed while a junior, experienced multiple assaults in her years on campus, primarily instances in which men had intercourse with her while she was too drunk to consent. As a teenager growing up in Tennessee, Marla was subject to a fairly relentless barrage of perhaps well-intentioned, but certainly nonetheless a barrage of shaming by her mother, whose insistence on baggy and modest clothing left Marla feeling simultaneously unattractive and as if the world were full of sexual danger. During new student orientation, she began to experience a sexual power she found thrilling. It was like, yeah, I can kind of see who I want to make out with at a party or hook up with at a party, and then I can just do it. I can just make eye contact and then it'll happen. On the fourth night of orientation, back in her dorm, after a round of parties, she received a text from a fellow freshman. But he was not just any freshman. He was, as she told us, Facebook famous, among the hottest guys in her class. That was a kind of power, too. When he texted her, "You up," those 4 characters meant something to her. She agreed to meet him in a stairwell, thinking that they'd make out. They did, but then he took out a condom. He pushed her up against the stairwell wall. Her sexual inexperience and the vulnerability of being drunk, combined with the power he exerted from being such a desirable partner, so clear in his sexual goals and apparently oblivious to the possibility that she might not share them, made the assault seem almost inevitable. We only have the story from her perspective, so it's hard to know what this Facebook famous man's sexual project was, but it seems safe to say that it was not related to expressing feelings or respect for her. It's the variability in sexual citizenship, then, that brings unequal social terrain into starker relief. When Scott said to Lucy, "It's okay," he was speaking to her from a land where her desires literally did not exist, where her claims to bodily autonomy were illegible or illegitimate to him. Similarly, when the junior who raped Cindy asked if she had a boyfriend, the implication was that the man's claim on her body would be a reason to stop, but her protests were not. He might have respected that man's rights, but he certainly perceived Cindy as a woman who had no rights. Heterosexual cisgender encounters show many instances of women having been socialized to question their own sexual citizenship. Cindy's reflection that he had come all that way across campus to see her was part of the calculus that drove her to walk back across campus with him, even though she wasn't that interested. Some people feel entitled to others' bodies, and others do not feel entitled to their own bodies. But it's our third key concept, sexual geographies, that more trenchantly reveals the campus-specific landscape that has a social patterning of power that elicits such bad behaviors. Spaces create and constrain opportunities. Those opportunities are unequally allocated. Again and again, gender and class year come together to impel first-year women into spaces controlled by upper-class men. Spaces are also a key dimension of institutional power that shapes student life. There may be good reasons for first-year students to have roommates, but those shared bedrooms often propel younger women into spaces controlled by older men. The experience of queer trans students challenges the singular focus on gendered power, which is often read in a kind of binary framework, in even more fundamental ways. Charlene, a white genderqueer student, was tall with a dancer's posture and a warm, engaging smile. Coming from a small town in Minnesota, they didn't have a lot of access to a queer community, and so a theater program in St. Paul in the summer after sophomore year of high school was a revolution. They recounted, I did a musical there, and it was the first time that I'd encountered gay people. More specifically, white gay men who were doing the show. And I was like, oh my God, they're gay. That's so cool. They were all older, quote, so they all automatically were cooler, and I wanted to be like that, because it was my first seeing of queerness. Charlene described their first sexual encounter as a rape. Charlene was drunk, and he was sober. The power imbalance also included differences in age and sexual experience. I had no knowledge of what was going on, and it was also a situation that was very pressurized because of the power dynamic. Because of that, I felt like I needed to do it. We see Charlene's experience as something particular to the LGBTQ youth that we spoke to. In search for connection with a sexual and gender community that is the very first place where they feel seen and recognized, where they feel like they might belong, intersecting with some of the same vulnerabilities that we saw within Marlas Story. Disparities in age, sexual experience, and levels of intoxication. Charlene's vulnerability in that summer theater program is inseparable from the socially produced isolation that many queer and trans youth face. I'll also just note as an aside that almost every single queer and trans youth person that we spoke to, no matter the quality of their sexual education, said that such sex ed was largely irrelevant to their own particular experience. Once at Columbia, Charlene was very involved with, and that most at home around, the network of other queer students from other schools in the New York area. Sophomore year, they were spending time with Jordan, assigned male at birth and transitioning. Jordan was from a nearby school, and they'd study together in Jordan's room, chill, and watch TV. Jordan and Charlene sometimes had sex, but Jordan wanted it a lot more frequently than Charlene did and would push for physical intimacy. Charlene found it hard to say no. Jordan would make a physical advance and they'd start to kiss, but if Charlene wanted to stop there, Jordan would say things like, "You don't love me. You don't want to do this with me. You should want to. You don't think I'm beautiful." Charlene knew what it felt like to be unsure of one's appeal, especially during a transition, and they wanted to be a source of support. This ended more than once in Charlene giving in, closing the computer, lying back, letting Jordan perform oral sex on them, and then reciprocating. Totally sober, within a relationship that was important to Charlene, such consent under coercion looks totally different than the kinds of experiences we described with Lucy. While in some of our examples, people who committed assault clearly had power in the form of resources, strength, status, it's not clear that Jordan had any of these things. But power does not always need to be possessed for it to be practiced. Jordan was able to exercise power by playing into Charlene's vulnerability to emotional manipulation. Power isn't just about maleness or whiteness or heterosexuality. The distinction between having and exercising power has important implications. Just because people don't quote-unquote have power doesn't mean they can't use it to achieve their goals. The prevention take-home is that even those who do not feel that they have access to much social power still need to be taught and to be attentive to the ways in which they can use power in interpersonal relationships. The impulse to affirm a partner's identity out of solidarity seems at least one kind of power relation that is specific to queer students. Jordan may have been manipulating Charlene because they knew about this impulse, about their feelings of being unattractive. Jordan's feelings of being unattractive may have been keenly felt, or it could have been a bit of both. And returning to our focus as space as an element of power, remember that Charlene's experience happened in Jordan's room. Programming focusing on consent, bystander intervention, or the dangers of alcohol will do little to address the kind of scenario that Charlene experienced. Of course, queer people also experience intoxicated assaults. Jackie, a white genderqueer engineer from a wealthy background, was active in campus social justice work. The only queer student in their high school, Jackie was excited to start off orientation week, having already connected with another queer student through the campus Facebook page. A queer party on their third night of campus seemed to be a great place to go with their new friend and connect with similarly identified students on campus. Jackie hadn't partied much in high school and was unprepared for how they'd feel after getting high in an upperclassman's room and doing a couple shots of that vodka back downstairs at the main party. At this point, they felt totally out of it. Kind of underwater, Jackie said, as they followed the pack first to an all-night diner and then back to their new friend's room. The group left Jackie alone with their new friend, and Jackie tried to leave but couldn't stand unassisted. The new friend guided them to the bed, kissed, fondled, and fingered Jackie. Jackie didn't want this to happen, but felt unable to move or to say anything. The new friend tried to get them to reciprocate sex, moving their hand, but Jackie was just way too out of it for that. Somehow, Jackie eventually made it to the elevator and back to their dorm room. Jackie experienced this assault as enormously harmful. In high school, there was no queer community, and this first experience with the other queer students on campus went terribly wrong. And it made them feel that maybe they'd never find a place they feel comfortable. The very promise of queer community produced a deep sense of loneliness and harm. Both of those factors led to this experience of assault and to Jackie's subsequent suffering, and those can only be seen through an understanding of the peculiarities of queer students' experiences. Frequently stigmatized and isolated in high school, they see colleges offering a social landscape where they can finally belong. But the relatively claustrophobic social world they face on campus means the negative experiences within the community, even within a city as large as New York, can create a context wherein abuses go unchallenged. To walk away would leave them with nowhere else to call home. Race as well as gender structures space. At Columbia, socializing spaces and music choices often reflect this taste and preferences of high-status white students. Fetty Wap was like the big song the entire time that we were doing our field work. And we had a lot of students of color complain about that. I also complained about it. This drives some students of color to seek partners off campus, away from classmates who might remember their bystander training and who, because of community norms of solidarity, might intervene to help them. Charisma, for example, felt turned off by the mainstream campus scene that she saw as fratty white guys who drank too much and had bad taste in music, couldn't really dance, and go for girls with straight hairs and thin noses. She was also frustrated by the relatively small number of black men, whom she deemed more suitable partners on Columbia's campus. She ended up in an apartment with a man she barely knew in Brooklyn, thinking they'd just make out and smoke a little pot and chill and watch TV, but instead he assaulted her. She wanted to leave, but the subway wasn't running, and she didn't have the money for a lift. Space, resources, and a racialized university context were all part of the power relations that explain her experience. We talk a lot in the book about how power dynamics on campus produce sexual assault. For example, the hypersexualization of women of color, particularly black students, is reflected and how persistently they are subjected to unwanted sexual touching. One man interviewed speculated that white women's apparent comfort grabbing his penis at a bar reflected both a racialized lack of respect for his autonomy and white fantasies about black penises. Black women expressed this even more consistently. Every single black woman student with whom we spoke had experienced unwanted sexual touching on campus. So that just bears repeating. Every single one. This becomes part of an unseen burden that black women bear. In the interviews, they noted it only to shrug it off as just one more indignity. Building campuses where black women feel like equal citizens requires complementing prevention focused on consent, alcohol, and healthy relationships with programs grounded in a framework of anti-racism, interpersonal respect, and the right to physical autonomy. The way that drunken campus assaults have dominated the public conversation exemplifies yet another form of power, discursive power. An exclusive focus on intoxicated assault, or the heavy attention to intoxicated assault, misses some important facts. The kind of heavy drinking that many people associate with college is actually an expression of racial and class privilege. Correspondingly, an analysis of shift survey data, part of our broader project, found that students of color are more likely to experience assault resulting from verbal coercion in the context of intimate relationships, rather than drunken assaults with a new partner they met at a party. And this is part of national level data that shows again and again that students of color, particularly black students, drink considerably less than white students. And this, you see this across all kinds of things, so both students overall, but if you look at black fraternities, for example, the rates of drinking are considerably less than they are in white fraternities. The singular focus on preventing intoxicated assault takes white student experience as universal, marginalizing the bodies and the suffering of students of color, and also doesn't fully develop a set of programming that can help them. Finally, heterosexual men's sexual assaults by women are also rendered invisible by discourses of gender and power, or by a strict attention to toxic masculinity as the sole or dominant explanation for assault. I want to note that these kinds of instances are numerically not nearly as common as those of women assaulted by men, nor do they happen at extremely high rates that queer or trans students experience assaults. The highest rates of assaults are within the queer community. And the aftermath of men who are assaulted is not always as acutely felt, but they do happen. In the SHIFT survey, about a sixth of the men had experienced some form of sexual assault by senior year, typically in the form of unwanted sexualized touching. In those cases, about 2/3 of the assaults that men experienced were committed by women. Rick grew up on a farm out west and joked before an interview began about how useless his cattle roping skills were in Morningside Heights. He wasn't from a wealthy background, and he told us that he was participating in our research because he needed cash. So we paid people $35 for an interview, and that's why he wanted to do this. He didn't categorize what had happened that night as an assault. Cassidy bought Rick drink after drink throughout the night, pressed herself onto him physically, and eventually went with him back to his room where they had sex. He awoke the next morning filled with misgivings and confusion and asked his friends what had happened. His male friends confirmed that from the moment they walked into the bar, Cassidy seemed to be intent on getting him drunk. They didn't think to intervene. He was heading for sex without even having to pay for it. So what was the problem? But his friend Renee had a different take on the interaction, and she raised the whole issue of gender, saying, if you were a woman, you'd be in hell right now. Ultimately, Rick decided it wasn't an assault and just took it on as a gross story. But not all the men who have these experiences shrug them off. Maddox was assaulted, and it was really unusual to hear a cis-hetero man describe the experience in those terms, at a party in his freshman year. It was the cast party from a play he'd been in, and everyone was very drunk. The next day, he had to piece together what happened. I remember mostly being fine and talking to this person, and then I was drinking, and then I blacked out. I don't remember anything else what happened except for a few flashes of being in a room. And then I was told what happened. He was told by her roommate, who had also been at the party, and was sort of uncomfortable with it. It was bad. I had some really good friends, and they were a pretty good support network. And then I had one friend tell me to call a hotline or whatever it's called. And I did that, and that was very helpful. The hotline was more like just having an ear to talk it through. And I don't know, it just sort of was therapeutic. My parents, it was more negative. I didn't tell my dad for a while afterwards, and then he was sort of like, he didn't take it seriously, didn't understand, and so we just stopped talking about it. I think my mom struggled to understand, but was put more of an effort. What did they struggle to understand, we asked Maddox. Just like, how can that happen to a man, I think? Both my parents struggled to understand that. They thought that it had to be very physical, like rape, like violent rape. And so they were just sort of skeptical, like, oh, how could this have happened? My mom sort of like struggled, but came through to like help me. And then my dad just sort of didn't, and so we didn't talk about it. Maddox described himself as asexual, and it's possible that his sexual identity provided him some interpretive room to label what happened to him as an assault. But if we read erections as barometers of desire, as Maddox's father may well have, it's impossible to conceive of a man experiencing penetrative assault as assault, particularly a cis-hetero man, unless he's being the one penetrated. And if the man is doing the penetrating, how could he be assaulted? Multiple forms of power create conditions in which sexual assaults occur. Power disparities related to age, levels of comfort in campus setting, masteries of the rules of the game, and disparities in social status, intoxication, levels of sexual experience, clarity about sexual projects, race, wealth, and control over space. Sometimes only one major power disparity is at play. Other times, the disparities seem to layer onto one another. I want to close with a couple of thoughts on prevention. First, and most importantly, we can't think seriously about doing sexual assault prevention and hoping that it'll be effective without programming that teaches us to think reflexively about power. Teaching about consent, those orientation week 90-minute sessions so frequently approach sex as a technical or cognitive exercise. Just do this, the message is, and your sex won't be assault. But sex is complicated, and our job in higher education is to help students develop their critical thinking skills. For some students, that means learning to see, acknowledge, and correct for the ways in which social forces tilt the playing field in their favor. This doesn't mean that they're bad people, but it does put them at risk for doing bad things. For other students, it means spaces and activities that prompt critical reflection about gendered norms of being nice in relation to their own sexual citizenship. One of the analyses of SHIFT survey data found that women students who had sex ed that included training in how to refuse sex were half as likely to experience assault on campus than those who didn't. It just bears repeating that often we think about college as the critical intervention point. One of the major points of our book is that it's not too late, but it should be a booster rather than the main treatment that people are getting. And then among those women who had sexual education that included practicing refusal skills, they experienced rape at half the rates of those who didn't. For all students, we need to help them learn to see how situational factors might silence a partner, not just literally, as in the person being blackout drunk, but also socially. Think about how Charlene's commitment to queer solidarity made them feel obligated to say yes to Jordan. But the whole point of making this argument about power is to suggest that campuses can take a much broader approach to sexual assault prevention, one that goes beyond bystander intervention and consent education. So let me be clear about three of these tied to our conceptual apparatus. The first is on geographies of equality. Equality is a sexual assault prevention strategy. And we need to think that not all sexual assault prevention strategies have to be about sex or sex ed. We can critically interrogate the allocation of social space, how it might not be allocated to concentrate advantage, but instead to moderate it. This would mean more space for younger students, students of color, and women to host and to control spaces of socialization. Instead of siloing sexual assault programming within the context of a Title IX office or some other office, we should do more holistic work on sexual assault prevention. This would require, for example, commitments to racial justice, all that grabbing of black bodies needs to be addressed directly, not just obliquely. And it reminds us that the roots of vulnerability extend far beyond campuses. Charlene's first seeing of queerness would not have been a first time if her high school had had a great gay-straight alliance. The final two suggestions, one is the one that Jennifer and I are really pushing for consistently, and I suspect in this public health context I'm preaching to a choir, is thinking about comprehensive sexuality education that begins quite young. And it doesn't actually have to be about sex, especially at younger ages, but about bodily autonomy, about fundamental conditions of respect. And I think, this is really me speaking that the left has abandoned the language of morality when speaking about things like sex, and that to its large detriment, because of the assumption that morality or conversations about morality and sex are about who you're having sex with rather than how you're having sex. And respect for the fundamental personhood of the other becomes really essential. And so we think that comprehensive sexuality education as a national level project is absolutely essential to create, in a kind of public health sense, herd immunity from the kinds of harms. And then finally, we think that communities are falling down on conveying to young people the importance of sex in their lives and what appropriate sexual projects should be. Almost every young person we spoke to had had parents talk to them about the importance of college for setting up their life and their career. Almost no young person that we'd spoken to had their parents, their families, their religious organizations, or their communities sit down and say to them, sex is going to be a really important part of your life. It's going to be a part of the life within which you connect to some of the people who are most important to you, and you need to think about what you want out of those sets of relationships. You need to be able to think in clear ways about how you want to articulate your sexual project. And that failure, we think, really increases vulnerability. Thank you. So we have like half an hour for Q&A. Happy to take any and all questions, especially students, but yeah.
Do you think that the legal framing of sexual assault stifles conversations about, I don't know.
Yeah, so the question is like, do you think that the legal framing of sexual assault stifles conversations? Jennifer and I have very little to say about law and the legal framing of sexual assault or questions of adjudication. And part of the reason is that we don't know anything about adjudication. We're not lawyers. It's not really our areas of expertise. That's a little bit of a cop-out. But a broader reason for this is that very, very few of assaults go reported. So if you focus on the process of adjudication, you generally are like assuming two things. If you're Betsy DeVos in the Department of Education right now, you're assuming that there's a huge amount of false accusation and that people need to be protected from that. If you're on the other side of the conversation, you're often assuming that there are sociopaths out there and that those sociopathic predators need to be caught and punished quickly because they're committing all of the assaults. And so the purpose of adjudication is actually to remove people from the community. Where to put them isn't really thought about that much, but it's like removal is the overall strategy. And there are sort of two things that we think about in this book in relationship to that. The first is that, in our survey on Columbia's campus, less than 5% of assaults are reported. So that is fewer than 5% are ever adjudicated. So if we focus on those sets of cases, the chances that we miss actually, the vast majority of what's happening is huge. Even if we get adjudication right, it's not going to be a prevention strategy. The second is that most people are assaulted by somebody they know. Most people are assaulted by someone they know, often by somebody they've had previous sexual contact with. And the sociopathology understanding of assault is something that's very it's convenient for us to hold. Because it's this idea that there are just a few bad people out there who are doing terrible things, but most of us are just totally fine. And we take a different stance, which is to say that sexual assault is normal. Not in the sense that it's acceptable, but it's actually highly predictable about the structure of everyday social relations, and that typical people commit assaults. Now, there certainly are sociopaths out there. They're probably committing assaults at much higher rates than other people. But if we want to think about prevention, I think we say, let's focus on those normal cases, by which we mean horrible cases where people are doing things that are often really harming others, but in ways that aren't necessarily intending to. One of the most shocking things in doing this research, which I'm sure there's prevention people in the room right now who would not at all be shocked by this, but for me, sort of coming new into the field, was the number of people who described to us contexts where they were committing assaults, where they presented the situation as them having sex. Mm-hmm. And so many people who commit assaults think, I would say quite earnestly, that they're having sex. And this requires a considerable amount of education as forms of prevention work. I'll say one last sort of empirical finding on this. It's very interesting in the focus work group to talk to women and men. So this is a very kind of cis hetero conversation about this, where men's imagination of what an assault is like stranger bushes, somebody screaming and trying to resist. And women's understandings of what assault is radically different. And I don't know how many of you have ever seen like drowning does not look like what you think it looks like. It doesn't look like someone thrashing violently in the water. It actually looks quite different. That there should be some degree of education of just how varied assaults are and how many look quite different than that. It's a long answer to your question. Other questions? Yeah.
Are there unique features of the case you studied, Columbia University? Is there anything unique about that world, or alternatively, are there things that you've captured here that you think really are universally extendable to other sorts of contexts?
Yeah, so the question was like, how unique is your case? How does that affect what you've said, and are there things that you think are very unique and things that you think are maybe more universal? So our case is very unique. I mean, we need to remember that like most college students don't go to colleges that are residential. Most college students live at home actually when they go to college, or they don't live like on a campus. Most college students don't go to a college that costs $70,000 a year and is in New York City. It's a particularly it's a very particular or peculiar kind of institution, and it's in a very peculiar kind of place. In the survey, less than 80% of the students identify as heterosexual, which is probably not representative overall of college campuses. And so those specificities really matter. To me, though, the question, I don't know that we have like universal findings, but I think we have a conceptual apparatus that might be applicable to broader sets of cases. And so for me, what would be interesting is to see other people apply that sort of conceptual apparatus and see is it useful or not. And so, I kind of turn it around to you and be like, if we were going to talk about Oregon State and we were going to talk about life here in this college in Corvallis, like would the ideas of sexual projects, sexual citizenship, and sexual geographies be useful? Could we think about the kinds of projects that people have in terms of the sex that they're producing? Could we think about the ways in which people understand themselves to have a right to say yes to sex, which is actually important, but also a right to say no, as well as a recognition that other people have those rights? And can we think about the geographies of experience and sort of embedded within terrains of inequality that may be useful as a heuristic, as a thinking device for making sense of this particular place? Yes?
I have sort of two questions.
Sure.
One is really using the term normal, which was a little bit
Yep.
disturbing to me.
Yep.
I can certainly understand predictable. I can
Mhm.
understand typical.
Yep.
But normal does seem to say it's okay.
Yep.
So just wanted to raise that question.
Absolutely.
For consideration. The bigger question that I had is, I don't know what the data are in terms of effectiveness of current programs to work to reduce sexual assault on campus.
Yep.
But the reading that I've done suggests perhaps not very much.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you gave recommendations, one very broadly framed to community, another probably to the school systems.
Yep.
If a campus were really, really, truly wanting to take this on, what are the recommendations from your work that you say do these X number of
Things right now. Yeah. Yeah, so just quickly on the term normal, it comes in part from my life as a sociologist and Durkheim. And so in Durkheim's work, he talks about things that are normal and pathological. Normal, which are things that exist across many social forms and are often produced by those forms. And so the famous example that Durkheim uses is crime. So Durkheim says crime is a normal social phenomenon. And what he means by that is not that crime is acceptable, but that all societies have crimes. And because as soon as you have a norm or some commitment to a rule, people are going to break those rules. And Durkheim argues that societies literally produce crime. Like it is not just something that happens, it's something that we produce. And so that's sort of the context with which you use it, although I appreciate that because Jennifer and I are in the middle of writing an op-ed where we use the term, and maybe I'll change it now because of it. So I appreciate that. You're absolutely right that there isn't a lot of evidence for programs that are effective for reducing sexual assault. There is some evidence that bystander interventions are effective, but the effectiveness of bystander interventions is pretty limited. we have a paper showing that bystander interventions are also highly socially situated. So people intervene in ways depending upon their social connection to the people who are acting poorly, and that they're often highly gendered. So most bystander intervention are men acting like good guys, which comes with a whole host of risks. That said, there is some evidence that it's effective, but we need to remember that a lot of assaults occur not under conditions of parties. They occur under conditions of what we would think of as forms of intimate partner violence. Nobody there is there beforehand. And we also need to remember that many assaults begin consensually, so that the moments where people might intervene, it's fairly challenging, because at that time things could be fairly consensual. And here, we sort of say that there are these there are social roles that are difficult to work within. So you may have the bystander intervention on the one hand, but we also have the social role of the wingman. So it's pretty difficult to ask your wingman to be a blocker, or to ask groups of students and people in general are often organized in such ways that they're trying to facilitate people having sex. And so to ask them to do something else, which is to prevent them, it can be challenging. So what are some concrete things that can happen right now across a range of college campuses that we think would move the needle on sexual assault? The first is that I don't know what's happening at this particular university, so I'll speak to what's happening at Columbia. Orientation should be radically restructured. Right now, what it is a series of rules that people are taught, don't burn candles in your room, and here's how you sign up for classes, and it's 30 to 90 minute seminar after seminar after seminar that is just massive information transfer, and it's hugely stressful and highly inefficient. And so one of the first things that we think about is restructuring that in order to create conditions of solidarity, or some kind of group solidarity. Second is we need to take a harm reduction approach to alcohol. If we think about the ways in which freshmen are policed for alcohol consumption, what we effectively do is drive freshmen out of spaces that they control into spaces that seniors control, so that they can go to a party. And this is a systematic exposure of risk. So one way to read what's happening at fraternities is that single-sex men's organizations are bad places. Another is to layer onto that a structural analysis of how we drive young people without much experience into those spaces at the period of time where they're at highest risk of experiencing assault. And that red zone that we talked about, which is not actually our observation, it's consistent across a range of literatures. The third is to think about the effects of institutional transitions. There's a lot of sort of a broad sense of college as being a really risky place, but most of the evidence is that colleges are not particularly risky places for experiencing assault. So for women outside of college, women who are not in college, the kind of best evidence from our perspective is that they're about 20 to 25% more likely to experience assault if they're not in college than if they are in college. And that for women in college, their risk of assault decreases every year that they're in college. That is the biggest risk is freshman year. And so one way to think about this is that colleges are dangerous, but another would be that no, the more exposure you have to college, the safer college is. And so we need to think critically about institutional transitions. And this is part of the orientation programming. So this is really where I would target a range of things with that orientation programming, because some students enter into college knowing a lot of people before they ever enter in. So they have entire social groups because they go to relatively advantaged high schools that send many people to college, and other people show up on campus not knowing anyone. And there's an enormous amount of social inequality that happens literally on day one. And colleges could do a lot to mitigate that. The other thing I would think about is the allocation of space. So the importance of the allocation of space on campus and who has control over space, particularly spaces of socialization. And so, this would be thinking about things creating spaces that are under the control of Black students and students of color, queer students, first-year students, women, challenging fraternity and sorority rules so that only the context where only fraternities are allowed to serve alcohol is something that's fundamentally challenged and transformed. These are sort of like small things that would happen along the way. And then I think that, Columbia has a swim test. So you can't graduate from Columbia without passing a swim test. I know. And, and like your lifetime risk of drowning is, about 1/1000th of your lifetime risk of like experiencing assault. And so we should think about actually moral education of our students, of which part of that moral education is actual sexual education. And that within our curricula, like this may be something that we have to provide, given the overall failure for it to happen on the national level. There were other questions. There was one there and a bunch back there. So yes.
It sounds like you gathered some data on experiences with disclosure or help seeking around
Yep.
sexual assault, and I was wondering if you looked at those in the context of these gendered power spaces and structures or other vulnerability factors.
Yeah, absolutely. So first I'll just say there's a paper in sociological science entitled "I Didn't Want to Be That Girl," the social risks of reporting, labeling, assault. I'm the first author on that paper. It was published in 2018. So if you're interested in the academic, my more academic answer to that, there's like a 10,000 word paper on this topic, and the book is like story, and there's a bunch of academic stuff that's more academic along those lines. So in terms of experiences with reporting, the formal reporting of assaults, in general the experiences are fairly negative. And this returns to sort of like the questions of adjudication and what's happening within these adjudication situations. And the framework that we kind of have right now is largely a framework of compliance to a set of legal standards. So, and that compliance framework doesn't do us, from my perspective, a lot of good. And the law is by design an adversarial process. So the logic, if there's lawyers in the room, they can argue with me about this. But the effective logic of the American legal system, and actually a lot of Western legal systems, is that two people vigorously make rational arguments before a disinterested party, and they advocate for themselves as strongly as possible, and then that disinterested party makes some kind of decision. And that's why the process is, it's literally by design adversarial. And we advocate in the book for very different approaches to thinking through adjudication. So, thinking about a social justice framework that has victims' needs at the center of the process, where right now there's no incentive to acknowledge harm, because the acknowledgement of harm is actually typically an acknowledgement of guilt, but that under that framework, basically what you've designed is a highly adversarial system where the only reasonable thing to do if you're accused is to deny, and that if you, there is great fear on the part of people who experience assault of the not all of them, but many of them, of the consequences of reporting on the person they're reporting against. Because we have to remember that many people are socially embedded with the person who's assaulted them. They may be in a relationship with them, they almost certainly have social ties to them across friendship groups, and they'll be associated with the total fracturing in their imagination, if not in reality, of that context. And so, I think moving away from contexts that think about legal compliance and instead take a much broader view of what justice looks like could be helpful. We recommend a series of things that institutions might think about, fully aware that some of them may be disasters, but it may be beneficial to have systems of no-fault reporting, where victims can report experiences that they've had where the person they're reporting against actually doesn't go through a punitive process, so that they understand how it is that other people experience their assault. that could be a disaster. I'm just putting that out there because it could mean that people are a lot of pressure is put on people to go the no fault rule versus some other kind of way. But nonetheless, we think it would be highly effective for people to get feedback on the ways in which others experience them. And so thinking about this broader understanding of justice and, basically having the sexual assault wing of justice movements meet what it is that a range of criminologists have been doing and thinking about community level justice would be really important. Okay, there were 3 hands back there. Yeah.
Seamus.
Yeah.
2 more questions.
2 more questions. Can we just stack the questions and then I'll answer all of them? Yeah.
You sort of already kind of touched on what I was going to ask.
Okay.
I just wanted you to maybe elaborate a little bit additionally on where spaces like this, it sounds like you're hinting towards maybe a transformational justice kind of approach
Yep.
to understanding the victim and the offender.
Mhm.
And I'm just curious what maybe you folks are conceptualizing in the way of healing for victims.
Yep.
And as a part of this aspect, and maybe you elaborate this more on the book, but just some concrete
Yeah.
suggestions or conceptualization.
Great. And then you had a question too, yeah.
Yes, so I was wondering, you mentioned one of the cases where it was a friend who indicated, no, that was assault.
Mhm.
So did you see any patterns of where folks, there were factors that affected them coming to terms like, oh yeah, this experience was an assault experience, and if you see patterns of that through different cases?
Yeah, so I'll just take the second one first. I hate to, again, refer to, but when you've written a lot of papers, there's a paper in the Journal of Adolescent Health. Jennifer is the first author, and it's about the social dimensions of consent. So it's about, we outline 7 different contextual factors that influence how it is that people interpret experiences as consensual. And we show a lot of external factors that influence whether or not people understand an experience as consensual. And so in general, that one example that I read where the woman said to the man, if you were a woman, you'd be experiencing this very differently, you'd be in hell right now. Very rare. The overall social pressures that we saw were not towards accusation, but instead reconciliation. And in fact, we have some pretty terrible stories in the book of, one woman who was raped by 2 of her friends, by a third friend telling her no, she got it totally wrong, and then literally finding out that she's gone to the hospital and going to the hospital, and while she's getting an exam, being like, you've got this totally wrong. And so in general, the social pressures actually moved overwhelmingly towards non-accusation. Things are typically, awkward but consensual. The restorative justice framework is kind of the framework that we mostly draw upon. I want to re-emphasize that, we are not the people who you should look to when thinking about restorative justice, because it's not our project, right? And I don't mean that it's not an important project, it's really an essential project. Our project is prevention, right? And so we draw heavily on a restorative justice framework in the end of the book in saying, this is one place where we should think to look and to draw upon the insights from that place in order to understand what it is that we should be doing. But I am not an expert in that. And so, we kind of take this pretty stark view that we want to work on, we want to move way upstream and make the rate lower. And there's going to be other people who are working post-experience who are going to think really richly about what to do after it. But we haven't done that work as effectively. I will say, though, that when thinking about restoration, I return to, and this is, the way in which maybe I don't know, I'm not that creative, or maybe it's just I'm disciplined in my thinking, the idea of sexual citizenship. And that part of the restoration should think about how it is that you reaffirm the sexual citizenship of both parties. And by that I mean that for the person who is experiencing harm, that you think about ways in which that person can understand their life and their sexual life as something where they have the right to say yes and no to sex. And that the person who's committed harm, that person understands that the people that they have sexual interactions with are fully formed sexual citizens just like themselves. And that really needs to be a central part of sort of education and reaffirmation, particularly among those who are committing harm. Ostracization is like, to me, with very few exceptions, not a workable strategy for both individual and community reconciliation and growth and transformation. So.
Okay, well, join me in thanking Seamus.